button now. The first thing I want to know is just if anybody's got any questions before we start. If you have, unmute yourself or type it into the chat. And then failing that, I'm going to introduce you to Martin and hand over to him. I'll just give you a moment for any questions. Okay, it looks, Martin, as though there are no questions. So I'm going to hand over and make you the host and say thank you very much indeed for agreeing to do this session. We're really quite excited by it. And all over to you now. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay. Hello, everybody. It's Martin Sandbrook here. This is unusual. I've never done this before. I've taught endlessly about systems thinking, of course, but not in these circumstances. So I'm hoping that my delivery in front of a computer is sufficiently animated and interesting to keep you all engaged. Just a little bit about myself and why I'm interested in systems thinking. I've had a pretty varied career. I was an accountant for many years, and then I was a chief executive of quite a big organization. I got very disillusioned with that and moved into the public sector and was in a training and enterprise council, if any of you remember those, for a while. And then I went into consultancy doing sort of process improvement, which I thought was systems thinking at the time, and I now realize wasn't. And then I found myself teaching business in a university. And while I was doing that, I went on a master's course at Bath University called Responsibility in Business Practice. And it was just one of those aha experiences where a lot of different strands of my life suddenly all coalesced into making me realize that a fundamental shift in the way that I was seeing things. Very exciting, but it left me thinking, if only I'd known this earlier, if only 30 years ago I'd had this, I'd have done my whole career so differently. So I came out of it absolutely burning with the desire to open other people up to this sort of enlightenment that I'd had. And so I've been trying to run courses in systems thinking. Well, I have been running courses in systems thinking ever since. And in recent times, I've been talking quite a lot with Katina and hearing about what is going on in the partnerships and realizing that you've got some very challenging systemic issues of trying to work in a very complex system. So today is really about trying to introduce you, if you need that. If you don't need it, then refamiliarize you with what do we mean by this term systems thinking and what does that mean for me. I'm hoping for you that you might find out whether you think it's useful, and if this taster of it leads you into wanting more, and if that's the case, then what sort of more might that be? Might there be some sort of training that would be useful or something of that kind? Just to start off with a little bit of a story, last week I was running a session very similar to this, but for a bit longer, 4 hours, with a group there's a group of partnerships under the heading of Making Every Adult Matter, which has to do with social exclusion. And there are 12 partnerships across the country that have won quite large amounts of money, and they're charged with being more systemic in their solutions. Obviously, there are very complex issues around social exclusion, just as there are, well, mental health is a part of that, obviously. And what I found was that these 12 had almost all done exactly the same thing. They started working with partners, and they had mostly mapped the system in some form or other, thinking that this would be a good first step in terms of systems thinking. And then they got stuck. They were hoping that the mapping would tell them what to do next, and they were disappointed to find that that's not the case. And if anything, it's made them realize that the system is so complex, they now don't feel that they dare do anything. So I was able to run a session with them, and I'll blow my own trumpet a bit. They went away inspired to go and start things, having connected with what I think systems thinking is. I keep saying it that way because this is my version of systems thinking. There are multiple versions of what we mean by this. So this is my idea. So if this is sounding a bit relevant to your situation, or if you're just interested in systems thinking generally, what I'd like to start off by doing is just to give you a bit of a run through of what I think systems thinking is. There's a route I have to get to this, which you'll see in a minute. So I'm probably going to talk for about another 25 minutes, if that's all right. Please put your hand up or put something on chat if you're falling asleep and want to interject and ask some questions. I could talk forever, so my issue is trying not to say too much rather than finding enough what to say. But what I'm hoping is I'll give you enough of a feel that you can frame some questions, but not so much that you feel driven into a corner by what I'm trying to do. And if you don't have any questions, I've got other things that I can suggest, some exercises that we might try and do, some things we could do interactively. So I hope you're comfortable with that way forward. So where I'd like to begin is that there was a man called Churchmen back in the 1940s who's considered to be one of the sort of fathers of systems thinking. And he said, systems thinking begins when we first see the world through the eyes of another. It sounds almost too bland to be possible, but it is actually an incredibly profound statement. Systems thinking begins when we first see the world, by which he means really experience the world, through the eyes of another. It immediately implies that you've got to be interested in what someone else has got to say. You've got to realize that it might be different to your own. You need to be curious about it. And if you're going to be interested in what how the other person's seeing the world, you've probably got to let go of your own need to be right in some way. And it turns out that a big part of systems thinking is letting go of the need to be right, which again doesn't sound like much, but turns out to be, for many of us, including me, quite enormous. So one of the things that is very helpful to do right at the beginning of systems thinking is to ask yourself, well, what are my assumptions and beliefs about the world? What do I assume is going on? What does the bell mean? Is that does that have any significance? Oh, that's somebody joining, is it, when I hear a bell? Yes, okay, fine, thank you. This is a very good exercise also to do with groups of people if you're trying to kind of break the ice, is to share assumptions and beliefs about a particular subject. And just to give you an exercise you can take away with you here, a very good way of doing this is to ask people to bring some kind of artifact, something that has meaning for them, and to introduce themselves using an artifact. So, for instance, I sometimes use a bunch of keys, and I say, I'd love to live in a world where keys were just not needed. So immediately you know something about me and my delusional sense of belief in how the world might be. So that's just an idea that you could use. Ask each other, what are your assumptions and beliefs, and use an artifact in order to do that. So having some idea of your own worldview, as it were, immediately starts to make you aware that there are different versions of worldview, and become more interested in what other people's worldview might be. And it also allows us to say, well, is there a prevailing worldview? And I strongly believe that there is, and I call it, for want of a better term, the mechanistic worldview. So a lot of the metaphors that we use, and these apply very much in terms of organizations and leadership, a lot of the metaphors we use are based on machines. So, we say the brain is like a computer, or the team work like a well-oiled engine. These are mechanistic metaphors, and not to put too fine a point on it, they're wrong. And they lead us into a very false belief about the nature of the world. Also, the mechanistic approach is very kind of reductionist in approach, so that if you want to understand something, we tend to take it to pieces. So, if we want to know how a bicycle works, one of the things we can do is to take it to bits to see how all the gears and cogs go together. Or if we want to find consciousness in the human body, we take to pieces the human body. But actually what we're then doing is taking to pieces the very thing that gives rise to the consciousness in the first place. So, so this reductionist approach, and actually I need to say something straight away. When I talk about these things, it might sound as though I'm dissing them in some way. That's not my intention. The mechanistic has its place. It's very, very useful. It's brought us immense progress in so many ways. So I'm going to just be arguing that it's incomplete and that there's a wider way of thinking that transcends but still includes the mechanistic. So if on occasion it sounds like I'm rather dissing some current ways of doing and thinking, then I'll please understand that I'm almost just doing that to set up a contrast. And if you want an example of how pervasive the mechanistic is, think of something like a hospital. You go into a hospital, you're basically walking into a mechanic's workshop. You go left to have your heart dealt with, you go right to have your lungs dealt with, you go upstairs to have something else dealt with. So a hospital is organized on the let's take it to pieces to see how it works model of the world, and has no concept of energy, for instance, which Eastern medicine has. So there's no department for energy in our hospitals, which is very much a kind of emergent property. So, and if I look at education, the whole way that we do learning, when I did my master's course 5 years ago, it was the first time in my life I've been allowed to write my essays in the first person. And I suddenly realized that my relationship with what I was learning was personal to me, and that I was allowed to have a relationship with what I was learning, whereas the whole of my learning career, as it were, before that had been about something over there, someone else's idea of what it was I ought to learn. And if I didn't agree with it, I had to find another expert to help me to disagree. And so this is not wrong. Obviously, objectivity in the scientific method has its place, but it's not complete, is what I'd be saying. So what I'm proposing is a wider way of seeing the world that's perhaps more appropriate to the kind of complex systems that we find ourselves dealing with. So immediately we've got a challenge because we've got this word systems. One word, many uses. Quite often when I say to people I run courses in systems thinking, they assume immediately that I'm an IT expert and I must be running courses in program design. And actually IT is intensely mechanistic, and I'm talking about something completely different. So system, unfortunately, if you look in the thesaurus, there's hardly any alternative words for it. And so we have to use it in lots of different contexts. So it's useful immediately to try to say, well, what kind of system are we actually talking about? And there's a very helpful practitioner here called Dave Snowden, who's put forward a kind of 4-part framework, which if I were to write it up on a flip chart, I would deliberately put sort of wavy dotted lines between the different parts of it so that we didn't immediately get into a mechanistic interpretation. But he says that there are broadly four types of systems. There are simple systems. So a bicycle's a pretty simple system. And there are not really very many of those, it turns out. There are complicated systems. So something like a jet engine is complicated. So complicated means that you've got layers and layers of simplicity laid one on top of each other. So you finish up with something complicated. But a complicated system, as long as it's working as it was designed, will do what you expect it to do. It won't have unintended or unexpected emergent properties. So a jet engine will produce thrust. That's its expected emergent property. That's what you're hoping it will do. And unless it breaks in some way, it's going to carry on doing that. If we then contrast that with a complex system has unpredictable emergent property. And as soon as we get human beings involved in things, we get unpredictable emergent properties. And it's mostly in the kind of areas that you're working in. You're dealing with complex systems, and mental health issues are an emergent property of complex factors that affect every individual differently. And the system of providers and others, while each provider might be providing something fairly straightforward and to them possibly simple, when you put all these different processes and systems that they're using together, you get something highly complex. And another way of distinguishing the complicated from complex is to borrow from E.F. Schumacher, who said that there are two types of problem in the world. There are convergent problems and there are divergent problems. Convergent problems fit in the complicated area, so that a convergent problem is capable of a solution. You can come to, with enough analysis, you can arrive at a single solution, and that will be the answer. So your jet engine's broken down, you're not sure how, you go through all sorts of tests, and there it is, some tiny little connection has broken somewhere, mend it, the machine works again. Divergent problems are capable of many, many answers. There is no simple, straightforward, single answer. And therefore, and actually a lot of the issues that you're dealing with are divergent in nature, not convergent in nature. But what Schumacher observed was that we love the convergent. We much prefer the complicated to the complex. And so what we tend to do is to drag all our problems across into the convergent and the complicated, hoping that we can find a single solution. And we use analytical approaches to do that. We use very mechanistic, objective style approaches to try to find those answers. And sadly, it doesn't work. It might work in the short term, but we find very quickly that the problem actually hasn't solved itself. So there are, of course, some very good tools to use, and there are many systems where treating them as complicated is appropriate. But in my experience, most of our problems most of the systems that we're dealing with become complex really quite quickly. And so we need different ways to deal with them. And so one of our assumptions, or one of my assumptions in systems thinking, is that what do we do if the world can't really be ever fully understood? An assumption of the convergent complicated is that with enough analysis, we can understand the world. But actually, if the world is complex, it doesn't matter how much analysis we do, there might always be some factor that we've missed out and so on. I'll say in a minute why, but this is not to say that mapping a system isn't a good idea. Knowing more about it than nothing is obviously helpful. But if we're in a systems mindset, then we're going to have very different expectations of that kind of exercise than we do if we're in a mechanistic mindset. So what do I mean, systems mindset? What is that? So I'm suggesting that we need to make a shift away from the idea that the world is mostly mechanistic to an idea that the world is actually complex and possibly unknowable. And this demands of us a very different way of going about in the world. One of the characteristics of the kind of mechanistic leadership, the kind of is heroic leadership, where people kind of, I know the answer. This is just a machine. I understand it. I can tell you what the answer is. And so people advocate a lot when they're in the mechanistic mindset. They tend to advocate. And I'm going to bring it now. The old finger comes up. You do agree with me, don't you? And even if you don't bring the finger up, it's there somewhere. So, in contrast to that, in a systems way, we'd be much more interested in inquiring. We'd be interested in saying, so what's your perspective, and how do you know that? Could I understand something about what you're saying here? What we're asking for then is kind of letting go of the need to be right about something, to develop a certain sense of curiosity, of learning, of inquiring. So we start to notice and describe things rather than judge and define things. If we're dealing with a machine, we want to say what it is, judge its performance, and define what needs to be done to it. If we're dealing with a complex system, we're more interested in noticing what it does and describing what it is, rather than jumping in to put some terminology to it that probably more reflects our individual worldview than it does actually what the machine or otherwise is doing. We need to be very flexible. So instead of, in a lot of the kind of mechanistic, rather heroic mindset, we make a plan and something crops up that we weren't expecting, and we think, let's ignore that, let's ignore that. Whereas in a systems world, we're saying, something's cropped up, this is interesting, let's stop and have another thing. So we're much more provisional in the way that we see the world. We might say we'll only go to first base and then see what we've got when we get there. And so we'll actually build in some processes to get together regularly so we can ask each other, so what did you learn? How did it go, what we decided to do? What are we getting out of it? Which is very different from trying to say, no, this isn't what we agreed. We must stick to the plan. And we have a kind of awareness of the games that the system can play on us. So, for example, when we talk about a system, we've immediately put a boundary around it. Well, a boundary, where does a boundary come from? If I ask you where's the beginning boundary of your digestive system, you'll probably say the mouth. And I say, fine, that's a perfectly good place, perfectly logical place to start. Why do you cook? And so, because, cooking got something to do with pre-digestion. Okay, so maybe we should put the boundary around the cooking activity. In which case, why do you select the particular things you do when you go to the supermarket? Oh, maybe we should put the boundary around the soup. So the boundary, you suddenly realize that you've put the boundary, and it's notional where you've put it. When you've got a machine, the boundary tends to put itself. The boundary of a car engine is pretty obvious. And also when you have a machine boundary, you tend to only look inwards from it. Whereas in systems, we have to be aware we put that boundary. It's not there. The only boundary that exists is the boundary around the universe, ultimately. And we have to put a boundary, otherwise we can't work with the system. But we must hold an awareness that we put that boundary. And what would happen if we shifted it? So a really interesting thing is to say, in relation to mental health, what would happen if we shifted the boundary of what we think is the system? And who does that then bring in? Or who does it exclude, depending on which way we move it? And if we've done that, how are we seeing the system now? Is it the same? So I can probably hear you saying, gosh, this all sounds a bit muddly and vague. So what I'm also saying is, we have to commit to things in systems thinking. We have to say, we're going to build the Severn Bridge. We're not just going to put up one, see if it works, and then try another one a couple of weeks later. This is going to be it. It's got to last for 50 years. So we do commit to things. But in the mechanistic, we tend to commit to things without an awareness that that's what we've done, because our assumption is that we're dealing with something obvious and logical here. Whereas in systems, we commit to things with an awareness that that's what we've done. And we just commit for as long as it serves us. So if we decide to do something, we're definitely going to do this. It's not as if we're just going to change our mind in half an hour's time. We will definitely do it, but we're going to do it noticing what's going on. And then if it doesn't work and it's not going as expected, being prepared to say, hang on a minute, do we need to review this? Maybe it isn't quite what we thought it was. So the first thing to determine then in system thinking is, what kind of system do we think we're dealing with? If we're dealing with a complicated system that has some aspects of complexity about it, a tool like systems dynamics can be incredibly helpful. I'm just going to hold up a book here called Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. So this is a really lovely book, very easy to read, really good on systems, especially on how to analyze the aspects of a system. How do we get to understand what's going on? So, she says things like, look past the players to the rules of the game. Or if you're going to map it, look at data over time and draw a line graph of it so that we can see the story that, oh, that's interesting. We get a much greater instance of this in November and May than we do in any other month of the year. I wonder why that is. So that's a really excellent book to start. But I do think it's important to say that Donella Meadows' worldview is that with enough analysis, we can understand the system. That's where she's coming from. And many people argue that systems dynamics is just a more glorified version of doing mechanistic analysis. I'm not dissing it at all. I love systems dynamics. But if we're going to be dealing with a truly complex system, we need something else. So I'm going to now suggest something here. One of the features of a system that you're involved in is that system comes through you. You are part of the system. And if you move, it moves. If you change, it changes. Now, these changes might be tiny, but they do happen. It's important to sort of be aware that as an actor in a system, you have influence. You may even have power. It depends. You'll be the best judge of that. And there's a wonderful phrase that comes from Leonard Cohen, which is, there is a crack in everything. It's where the light gets in. And so why do I suggest that? Well, what I'm saying is if we can just make a crack in the system, it's surprising how much light will come through. So I'm going to suggest an approach called action experiment. It's the two words of that heading explain what it is. First of all, it involves action. And second, it involves being experimental. So let's take the being experimental first. That is about the mindset of curiosity, commit for the time being, let it go if it doesn't serve, pay attention to what emerges, learn all the time, just go to first base, notice, not define, describe, not judge. These are all aspects to do with experimenting. So, we might be trying out, it's very scientific if you like, we're trying out a hypothesis. And action means you get your answers to your experiment by acting in the world. You don't reflect on it, talk about it, write essays about it, write learned papers about it. You get out there and you do something. But you do something deliberate and conscious, and while you're doing it, you notice, you try to hold an awareness as you're doing it of what's going on, both in you, what's happening in me, especially here in my chest, what's going on for me emotionally, which is sometimes something we don't kind of take account of, but also what am I noticing is happening in the other, either in the system as a whole or in the person that I'm currently interacting with. And what am I learning from that noticing? So what we have in action experiment is a cyclical process. We do some framing, which means we set the scene. What's the context? Why am I interested in this? Why do I want to know more? Especially, why is this a bit edgy for me? That's a very good place to start with something where you've got something, bit of passion invested in it. If there's one thing in the world I'd like to change in this ruddy system, it would be this. That's a good place to begin. And then having framed it, you say, what's my aspiration? Important word, aspiration, not what's my target, what's my goal. An aspiration is something much more diffuse and therefore something that you're going to be happy to let go of if you find it wasn't the right aspiration. So you say, how would I like this to be if it was different to what's annoying me about it now? Then you do some reflection. Yes, reflection definitely has its place here, which is along the lines of what questions are arising for me? what would it be like if, how would it be if, what's going on here? You might notice I'm trying to avoid the why is this like it is, especially why am I like I am, because we tend to find if you start asking yourself that question, you often just answer it according to what you thought was already the answer. So we're trying all the time to think, what are some of the questions that I want to find answers to? And from those possibly many questions, we want to bring out, what's the thing I really, really want to know here? What would be different if I could work with my partners in a different way, or I could work with that particular partner in a different way, or how can I have an open systems-y mindset of curiosity about this issue that's causing me this problem? And now we get the bit that's not the easiest always, but is converting that question into action. And we use a phrase, something like, how do I act in the world when I say, how do I act in the world when I say, I'm no longer having a row with this person? Or how do I act in the world when I say, I understand why they've taken that particular view? And if you can state it in that way, it usually points fairly clearly to what it is you need to do. So then you go and do it. And you go and do it consciously and deliberately. Of course, we often experiment all the time. We do experiments with things. I might experiment with cooking a dinner, but the difference here is that we're doing it very deliberately, trying to notice what happens. And then we reflect on what we notice. What notices, the noticing inner and outer, what we call arcs of attention. Inner arcs, outer arcs, what's going on in me, what's going on out there. And as a result of that reflection, we can frame again, what am I now interested in, check our aspiration is still relevant, and then go around the cycle again. So that's action experiment. If you want to try this, I might explain a bit more later if you're interested, because there's a tendency to want to plunge into this at a very high level, and actually it needs a bit of practice with something small. That's why I've said there is a crack in everything. If you can find a small crack. So for example, something you might try is, instead of advocating, next time you go to a meeting, instead of advocating, I'm not saying advocating is wrong. Sometimes it's absolutely the right thing. Try inquiring instead. But because people might not be used to you doing that, you might just want to frame, in other words, explain why, give a bit of context. Today I'm going to ask questions instead of advocating. Maybe tell a story. I heard this chap on a webinar yesterday saying this might be a good idea. And then go in and say, ask your question, a brilliant question, which can be one that you definitely might need to put a bit of cotton wool in front of, is, how do you know that? Which can come across as being quite an attacking question. So it's better to ask it with, I'm really interested, what's the source of your information here? How do you know what you're saying is correct? And they say, oh, well, I read it in the Daily Mail this morning, because we often move on the basis of very provisional information. Or you might just go around noticing systems. That's an experiment that you could do. Or ask yourself, how do I know that? That's a really good question. How do I know what I know? And why do I accept that? So these are little experiments that you could try just to get a bit of a feel for how it works. So I'm proposing that we think of the world as complicated and convergent, when really, mostly, it's complex and divergent. And therefore, we need to shift away, both in the way we see the world, the way we act in the world, and the approaches we use, from that mechanistic way of being to using approaches that are more appropriate to the complexity of our world. So I'll shut up now and see whether you're still listening, and whether you've got any questions.
If anybody's got questions, you can just unmute yourself, and obviously, one at a time. Or if you want to type in the chat, then I'll happily share those with everybody else. There's always a very slight time lag, Martin, so don't worry too much.
Sure.
While people are typing or kind of thinking, as you were talking, I posted two things. But Fiona has asked if you could talk a little bit more about convergent and divergent systems to help understand that.
Okay, so a convergent, it's quite important to say that what Schumacher said is convergent problems. The system may or may not be convergent, but what we're really saying is the problem that we're dealing with will be convergent, in that a convergent one is capable of a single solution. We often assume that when we're dealing with an organization, say, that the solution is that we change our recruitment procedures so that we don't get this sort of person again. And of course, it turns out that that's just part of the picture, and there's many other things. But our assumption there is that by changing one thing, we can find a solution. But Schumacher said that, in fact, these sorts of problems are pretty rare in any kind of social system. They're obviously common when we're dealing with our car engine, and they'll put the diagnosis machine in, and it'll come up saying, is something wrong with your inboard computer or whatever, and change it, and the problem solved. Divergent means, let's give you an example of a divergent problem. I'm not sure why this one always comes to mind, but something like the attitudes to abortion, say. Some people think it's right, some people think it's wrong. They are probably never going to agree with each other because they're coming at that problem with entirely different worldviews. Their whole background and basis for thinking and belief is different from each other. But we tend to take a convergent approach to that problem by shouting at each other louder and louder, saying, I'm right, I'm right, I'm right, until the other one is drowned out. But actually, what we need to do, I'm not suggesting this is easy, of course it isn't, because we're talking about belief here. What we need to do is to understand that each of us hold that different view, and our background and experience and life processes probably sort of entitle us to hold that view, or it's completely logical that we would hold that view on the basis of our background and experience. So if we're going to shift from that point of view, we need to go much deeper into understanding where we're each coming from, rather than pointing at each other and saying, you're wrong. And that's when we might say, well, can I really understand why you hold that view? What are your assumptions and beliefs here? And we could have a very, very different conversation when that happens. So that's a divergent one. And Schumacher was very keen that we use different approaches to dealing with divergent problems.
Fiona's just said thank you for that. Anybody else got any other questions that they want to ask Martin or pop into the chat? Martin, as you were talking, two things that came to me were, Lloyd, you've got a question, have you? Just unmute yourself if you have.
Hi, have you switched your mic on?
You can, I'll unmute you if you've got a question there, Lloyd. It looks like you might have. I've unmuted you, Lloyd, if you have a question,
No,
did you?
fine. I'll just continue and listen, thank you.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you.
It looked like you were shuffling around. So, Martin, the couple of things that came up for me, I can see what's happened, actually. You're sharing your screen with us, Lloyd. And so we can all see a huge picture of you, which is really nice. You might want to unshare your screen. So there's down the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a number of options. One of them is share screen. If you click to stop sharing that screen, then we will kind of get back to a picture of Martin.
Sorry, something I've just put up there is if anyone wants to kind of go back over what I've been talking about, I've put a website address there, systemslearning.org, and there's kind of 6 15-minute kind of TED Talk chats on there of me talking about different aspects of systems thinking, and also quite a lot of materials, readings and so on. So if you want to have a bit of a catch up on what you've heard me say today, then that site is a possibility. And that's connected to the Schumacher Institute site, which is where I have my basis. And you can find learning courses and stuff on there if you're interested in any of that. Sorry, continue. I think you're about to ask a question.
So I suppose the thing I was thinking about is that going around the pilots, lots of pilots have got two areas of, if you like, conflict where it feels like systems thinking might be helpful. One is that the government, the funding for this pilots that we're doing, has a mechanistic divergent approach. It really does want to find one solution to helping people.
That's convergent
approach. It wants to find one solution to helping people with mental health problems, and it wants to find one solution to getting them into work. Unfortunately, it's aware that it can't find one solution so far, but that doesn't mean that the systems aren't geared to doing it in that way. So as a result, the pressure on the pilots is for us to commit ourselves to a way of trying to understand the results that we get and the interventions that is really pretty convergent. The reality, though, for pilots in terms of all the things they need to make happen that might stand a chance of getting the results that they're looking for, is for them to take a divergent approach. And that appears to be particularly the case with people's partnerships, where it is their partnerships where, with the health service, for example, where people work to a completely different timetable, completely different view of the world, completely different priorities, that are causing very real difficulties in a system, a pilot that is set up to deliver X by Y, no matter what. And it's how might this help us with some of those tensions, I guess.
Right. So is the X by Y predetermined, or is it for each pilot to try and work that out for itself?
Okay, so each pilot was able to bid to a specification, which was fairly loose. So we do have 61 pilots all doing slightly different things, but the measures that are being used are identical for each pilot. And those measures are the measures that were used for the NHS for setting up its increasing access to psychological therapist service. So the measures are not necessarily measures of learning. They are measures of mental health outcomes that come from a different system.
Okay. So what I'd say is that in the course of working in a divergent way, you probably work in a series of cycles of being quite convergent. When I said you commit to something for the time being, that can look almost the same as going for the one-point solution. But if we're going for a one-point solution in a mechanistic way, we tend to invest everything in that and believe fully that it's going to work, and sort of suspend any sense that we're being experimental here or that we're trying something out. Whereas if we're doing it in a systems way, we say, well, this is our assumption about what is going to work. And we're deliberately doing it in this way to see whether it does work. And we might measure it according to, if it works, we will find more people engaging. But we are going about it in such a way that we're noticing what happens. We're not sure, once we've done step one, what step two will be. So we're doing this in a very collaborative way, and we've got together and collaboratively agreed what it is we're going to do. And that's included some collaborative framing, collaborative aspiration setting, collaborative reflection. So we understand each other pretty well. We've had a good go at understanding each other's assumptions and beliefs, motivations, constraints, and so on. And we've come up with this shared action. And we're all doing it, or one of us is doing it, but we're all noticing what happens. And we've agreed that we are going to come back together pretty quickly to share that noticing in a very open way, and we're going to describe to each other what happened. We're not going to try and judge it. We're not going to say, didn't it go well or didn't it go badly? We're going to say, this is how it went, and what do we think has happened or is happening as a result. So we're very much moving forwards. One of the assumptions I think here is that when we're dealing with convergent, we tend to do a lot of analysis because we assume that analysis will point us to the thing that we need to do that then becomes the single solution. When we're in a systems mindset, we're saying, well, actually, this is too complex to really ever understand it. Let's move forward rather than looking back, because analysis tends to be looking back. Let's move forward. Now, one of the things you might move forward to do is to say, let's move forward by trying to understand the system better. But you would then say, we are only trying to understand it better. We're not trying to fully map it. And we realize that what we come up with is provisional and maybe incomplete, but at least it's giving us some indication of what's going on here. So but that's only one thing we might do. We might try any number of things, but what we're doing is we're accepting that this is experimental, that we're doing it in action rather than talking. We're trying something out. We might therefore try something out that's pretty small, just to get used to it, to see what happens, to make sure it doesn't have too much risk associated with it. But we'll do this in such a way as we're going to reflect and share on the description of what comes out of it before we then decide what to do next. So we commit to it for the time being, but we commit to it only as long as it serves us, rather than saying, this is the one true way, I know I'm right. So these differences sound subtle, but they're really not subtle, actually. They represent a very different way of being in the world, between this mechanistic and complicated and complex. I'll stop there in case you've got a supplementary. Did that answer your question?
It caused several more, but I was just kind of pausing in case anybody else wants to chip in or ask anything more. I suppose I was wondering what happens if you've found yourself up a gum tree already. So if you, most of the pilots had money for workforce development at the beginning and they set up steering groups. But often part of the plan was that they would set something up in train in order to get from A to B. And if A is delayed massively or doesn't appear to be getting you to B, people seem to be stuck with A and not able to get to B. And yet somebody like me is nagging horrendously now of, why aren't we at B? You know, how come we haven't got to B? And people are saying, well, we're stuck at A, and we're stuck at A with our partners because in the beginning we said this is what we would do, and we're stuck now. And I just wonder if systems thinking, how, so kind of what people would need to do next. And I suppose I'm thinking then, how would training help us do that? What would people need to do next to be able to get out of the stuck up a gum tree without falling out with local partners who they need to work with long term?
Well, I would be saying they need to devise some form of action that they could go and take, where they've let go of the need to be right. They are open to understanding what, something about where other people are, and maybe to trying out some small activities to see if we can come unstuck. Now, action experiment can either be done individually, so I do it. I might involve other people in it, but it's basically me doing the acting and then noticing what's going on, or it can be done collaboratively. So you could get together as a group and do a lot of open reflecting on where are we now, in order to say, and where is it we'd actually like to be, so that we can then devise some possible ways that we might agree together that we could move forward. Now, obviously, the minute you sit down in that, the fingers come out. Oh no, it's your fault. Or we've done what we said we'd do, and it's nothing to do with us that this isn't working. So, I'm not going to. Don't think I'm trying to wave a magic wand here. I'm not. I know what the reality of working in partnerships is. I know some of the rules, and so I was involved with the project myself in Bristol between social services and medicine, and the medics would never open the files. So the people in the social services side, this was to do with mental health, could never get access to information that they really wanted, because it's an absolute rule of medical confidentiality that you don't open someone's file. And that was a fundamentally different rule of the game between these two systems. And I have to say that that project in the middle of Bristol closed down as a result, because it couldn't function together, just couldn't. And the system condition there went all the way back to the individual secretaries of state, who were saying, no, you must stick to your way of doing things. So it's possible that the system is absolutely stuck, but on the assumption that we're going to at least try to shift it on, it needs some open experimental action from an individual who's going to try out some little things different to see if things can be shifted. And this is more difficult if you haven't really done this before, getting everybody around a table and saying, what could we do collaboratively? But my suggestion would be that people try out some individual experiments. Now, at this stage, normally, if I was running a course, I'd get you to be devising some experiments. I'd be saying to you, what's edgy for you now? What's really the grit in the sandwich that you'd like to change? Go and do some reflecting on that and decide what it is, how you'd like to change it. And then I'd be inviting people to come back to me with their ideas for doing an experiment, so we could talk them through together. And almost invariably what people come back with is something too big. They're too ambitious immediately. And, when you look at it, you can see that what they're going to do, either when it comes down to it, they're not going to do it because they'll be too anxious, or the risks of it are too great. So it's amazing what you can achieve by doing something very small. So, for example, if you thought you might go into a meeting and introduce everybody to systems thinking and have everybody jump in a ditch and tell you that you've become a hippie and you're talking nonsense, try out the one person in that group who you know well and knows you well, and take them out for a drink and say, hey, look, I was listening to this thing, I'm not sure, what do you think? And have a discussion about it and see, just test the water a little bit, see. And they go, oh yeah, wow, that sounds fantastic. I wonder if we could do something with that. Do you see what I mean? So there is a crack in everything. It's where the light gets in. You're only looking for a crack initially to try and shift the system a bit, to try and shift yourself a bit, to try and build up your muscles for this, get a bit more confident. So, and it's amazing what you can learn if you do some really good noticing, maybe keep a little bit of a journal. It's amazing what you can learn about the system, about yourself, about your own assumptions and beliefs when you start to try something out. And sorry, I'm going on a bit here, Harrowers, but very often what happens is people will start with something that's out there, in the system, and very quickly what they come back to is something that's in here. I know what's going on here. It's my assumptions and beliefs about this system that are really the block for me, not actually what's going on. It's what my own expectations about what's happening here. And so now actually maybe what I need to be experimenting with is something to do with my own way of seeing rather than everyone else's way. But I'm only reporting on what I've found has happened often in my experience.
I wonder if that's triggered any examples from anybody else then, or any kind of ideas, and maybe people could share those, because I'm mindful of time. Just unmute yourselves. Oh, go on.
Yeah, Sarah here. Hi, we're going to a meeting tomorrow with partners. I'm just thinking I might have a little go. What do we any suggestions, then people will just turn around and say, well, that won't work because, you know, we always do it like this, or there's a system in place, or, you know, kind of barriers that are going to come straight back to you when you say, let's think how we'd like it. Is there anything that works?
Yeah. So what you might be doing there is if you go to advocate your idea, then I don't know how you find about advocating, but you do agree with me, don't you? So when I talk to you like that, you know immediately what happens inside you is you go, no, I don't actually, and I'm not going to if you're going to talk to me like that. So it's amazing how often, even quite subtly, we advocate, and it's amazing how rarely we're genuinely interested in the other person's perspective. So it may be that you devise an experiment, but the first stage in that experiment is asking, openly asking, not in any way communicating that you've got an idea that you'd like to try out, but is really displaying a sort of genuine curiosity to get the other person's perspective. Systems thinking begins when we first see the world through the eyes of another. I can't stress that enough. And if we can really get that person to tell us how they're seeing the world, the chances are we'll go, oh gosh, I wish I realized that before. You know, we're just talking past each other here, aren't we? Oh, well, now I've understood that. Would it make sense if? And I don't know, maybe you have already, but I find that this question is very rare, that people genuinely want to know what the other person's assumptions and beliefs are. So another thing I'd suggest, if you devise an experiment, imagine yourself doing it. If you immediately feel anxious and think, no, I'm not going to do that, then don't do it, okay? Think of something that's a step or two before that. I had a homeopath, was working with a homeopath recently in Belgium, and they were excluded from practicing, and they were trying to find ways back into practicing. And one of them said, I'm going to ring up the GP of my patients and tell them that I feel I ought to let them know that I'm working with their patient. And I said, okay, that sounds quite high risk. Are you going to do that? And he said, no, I'm not. So I said, okay, so what will make it possible for you to do that? He said, I'll ask my patients if it would be okay if I ring their doctor. And if they say yes, then I'll have both a reason and a basis for doing it. So that's just a way of showing that he came back a couple of steps towards himself to find something that, yes, he could do. And he went and did it, and it was huge. It was huge for him. You know, it might sound like a really small thing, pick up the phone, or actually ask his patient and then pick up the phone. But actually, it was very big in terms of, oh, wow, that's really changed something. So I can't sort of stress enough, start small, hold the mindset of being experimental, see what happens, don't judge it. You know, if you think I'm going to go to a meeting and not advocate, and the first thing you do in a meeting is advocate, don't say to yourself, oh God, I'm such a failure. Just say, that's interesting, I advocated. No, I wonder what I could do differently next time. So it's about noticing. It's so important, this describing, not judging. I must shut up because I can see the clocks ticking away. Does that help? Sorry.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Katina, it'd be useful if we could maybe pick this up again a bit later.
You're on mute, Katina.
Oh, sorry, I'm around this afternoon, Sarah, so I'll give you a call.
Okay.
I just wondered if anybody else has got any other examples or questions, or Martin, if people had more training, wanted training, what would it involve? What would it look like for them?
Well, my ideal training is to have things spread out a little bit, because then we can get some cycles of action and reflection, and also learning gets deeper the longer you go at it. I have run several times a program called Pale Blue Dot, which has a kind of a day of really introducing systems thinking in a bit more depth than I've done today. And looking at action experiment more thoroughly and devising some initial experiments that people can go away with, leaving them 2 or 3 weeks to try something out, and then coming back together, reflecting together on, so what happened? How did it go? What did you notice? And let's learn a little bit more. And now let's devise some more experiments and try going out and doing some more. And doing that for as many cycles as anyone has got time for or money for. The more the better, but obviously I realize, everyone's constrained. But I've certainly found with the program that we've run, the Pale Blue Dot program, which has involved about 4 follow-up sessions, people have really, really shifted in that time and tried out. For example, one of the participants was going into city council meetings and saying, I suppose we could just try this out rather than assume we've got to get it right first time. And people would say, oh, we've never thought of that before, that we could experiment rather than, or suggesting, I'm going to deliberately do this, but I'm going to ask some questions now rather than, so just changing the flavor of meetings. And this, it sounds like nothing, but actually turns out to have had a very big effect. Yeah.
And any kind of, I've gone down a tangent now, because the reason I asked, so I'll just pose this to everybody else. The reason I asked is because I'd like to know if people who are attending are interested in us taking this further, really. And I'd welcome you typing into the chat if you don't want to speak, to kind of just say whether you'd be interested, and whether, Martin, we could do some of this virtually, because one of the problems for lots of the pilots is coming together physically in one place. We might be able to manage one kind of physical coming together maybe, and maybe another one at the end or something, but in the middle, how feasible would doing it virtually like this be, so long as they all occasionally spoke?
It would be feasible to do it virtually, as long as you say, I think checking in, spoken check-in is pretty important. And I do find that the face-to-face interaction is an important part. So I think, having experienced Zoom like this, it's possible. It's not ideal, but we've got to be pragmatic. And so I think we could do something. Yeah.
And would that work best as a group? Last time we did a session with our media person, and he ran a session for everybody, and then he'd ran some one-to-one kind of coaching sessions, and people recorded those, and they had those to take away with their kind of action plans and things. Is that kind of a useful approach, or is it better for us to do it as a group so that we learn from each other all the time?
Well, I'm very keen on the idea of learning groups where, this systems thinking thing can make you feel quite isolated. It's not the way that the world thinks. It's not the way the world acts. So it's good to have some mutual support amongst peers who are also doing the same thing. I'm very happy to give support by email or over the phone or whatever, but that's not quite the same as having someone who's absolutely doing the same job, understands the same issues, that you can share stuff with. So some kind of grouping is helpful. What's this? Okay. Of course, the ideal would be for the partnerships to go through this together. That would be, my dream would be for any partnership to go on a systems course together as a group. So everyone who normally sits around the table trying to understand and work with the system all come together. But obviously the chances of that happening, I guess, are pretty thin. But at least if we could have some of the people who are in the pilots, trying to get the pilots running effectively, that would be great as well.
I wonder if anybody did do that. I mean, all of the pilots had workforce development money up to a maximum of, I think 50% of their money, so up to kind of £40,000, and have done some workforce development, maybe have not done all of their workforce development yet. My sense so far has been that most people invested that money in training that was quite specific around mental health rather than specific around partnership working or kind of systems thinking. But maybe some of you are going to tell me differently, and that you use some of your workforce development money for systems thinking and have got an action experiment we could kind of look at, maybe. I'm staring at the blank chat box now. Everybody wants
Hi, it's Helen here. It's Helen here. I think I've muted myself. Has that worked?
Yep, it's lovely.
Yes. I suppose what we've tried in Oxfordshire was probably attempting to inch towards what we thought something a bit systems thinking like might be, with the workforce development, which was to bring together community learning and mental health practitioners and to pair them up to find out more about and get to understand one another's sectors, and then to develop some new courses using the kind of the learning focus driven by the skills and experience and so on of the community learning practitioner, but bringing mental health perspectives onto it. And I suppose where we are with that now is that it's been immensely exciting to be part of and to see how people have taken on the kind of challenge of doing this and kind of shifting their own thinking about what it meant to be a practitioner working with people with mental health difficulties, but also some real challenges, particularly because I think in some instances we've seen people quite quickly sort of retreating back behind their own professional boundaries a little bit, and so having to do quite a bit of work to help people to move beyond that, and I suppose to develop some of that more inquiring and open kind of mindset that you've described, Martin, really, where it's not about, the finger doesn't come up, I suppose, and so you're not saying, no, but I'm saying we should be doing it like this because I know X, Y, Z, to exploring a bit more in their pairs, how collectively they would like to address some of the issues they've identified around the ways they might support learners. Yeah. So I think we'd find it really, we've probably learned quite a lot from it, and I'd be really interested in sort of sharing it and getting some reflections from others on this, because I think we started out with great aspirations for doing something a bit different by bringing people together like this to work very closely to create something new, and we probably generated quite a lot of learning from it, I think.
Right. Well, it sounds amazing, and what I'd be saying is just describe it. Don't try and judge it, because you don't really need to say whether it's been good or bad. It just is, and what it is sounds like it is very systemic. And the words that were coming into my mind, and this is why actually systems thinking tends in the end to find its way towards some kind of slightly spiritual dimension, is that empathy and compassion are needed for the situations that you each find yourselves in. When people start retreating behind their professional walls and so on, that's usually entirely because of the pressures that they themselves find themselves under, or because they feel vulnerable, or because they don't really understand what's going on. And what's needed then is probably the opposite of what we tend to do. What's needed is understanding, compassion, care, inquiry, sympathy, rather than, some kind of accusation, which is what often happens, and it sounds very much as though that's what you're working towards. So I'd be saying, carry on. Sounds very much as though you're working in an experimenting systemsy way, and very much rooted in systems thinking begins when you see the world through the eyes of the other. That's it so does come back to that, and then let go of the need to be right yourself.
Yeah, and I think, I was quite struck at the start when you were saying about, the boundaries of where you put them, because I think there has been a certain amount of work done from the community learning sector about trying to understand what systems thinking might mean in a community learning context. But of course, in a way, we've probably ended up with a community learning system and a mental health system kind of rubbing up against one another, and having to take apart the boundaries of those two systems that have been created to think about what that looks like if you start to try and integrate it.
Boundaries are just so fascinating, because there aren't any boundaries. We make them up. Sometimes are very hard for people to accept. Obviously, there are boundaries given by buildings and these sorts of things, but most of our boundaries are notional. They're rules that we've devised for ourselves, or professions have devised for themselves, and they're made up by people. They don't exist in any reality if we understand reality in that way. That's not to say they're easy to shift. They're not, but they are mostly shiftable. But at least recognizing what they are and how they got there can be a huge advance in terms of understanding the way the system maintains itself. Because systems do maintain themselves. They're very clever at, well, no, that's to give them consciousness in some way. But the way things are organized, if we carry on doing the same, we'll get the same result. And that's very much a definition of a description of how systems work. That Donella Meadows book is incredibly helpful on understanding, she's got a chapter in her book on systems traps. I'm just sorry, I've got some notes here. Traps and opportunities. And she goes through all the ways that the tricks that systems play. And she also has a very good chapter in there on leverage points, where to leverage, where to intervene in a system to get the maximum leverage. And in her mind, the best way is at the level of the way people think. We tend to intervene at much lower down, where we measure stuff and in outputs and outcomes. And she's saying, if we want real change, we have to do something about the way people are thinking about the system, especially about their different perceptions of it. So, I was just going to say, Katina, I could, if people wanted to send me an email address, I could do a Dropbox and put a few useful papers in if people wanted to have a look at some things.
Yeah, thinking about, you've got access to the website, so you can either send them to me, or we can put them up in the closed section for pilots. Okay. Anybody who's not a pilot, I'll have a look through. The other thing is a couple of posts while you've been talking. So Chris from Blackburn posted about how their partnerships have evolved over time around reaching learners for courses. And what was quite interesting in that was when we set up the pilots, we told people to go off and find certain kinds of partners. And what he seems to be saying here is that what's been more fruitful is not the ones they were told to go and find, which was the system ones, but the ones that have come along since. And one of the things that might just help other people with that is that when we said to you, go and find a health partner like IAPT or Recovery College or Samaritans, it was because we were only allowed to put a few examples in for the Skills Funding Agency into their system, if you like, as BIS, even though we were the funders. But more importantly, we had wanted, for example, to put Union Learn in, who were really keen to work with pilots, but we weren't allowed to. We were only allowed to put NHS kind of mental health ones in. But that didn't mean that people couldn't partner elsewhere. And one or two people did, but not many people were brave enough to step outside of, that parameter that had been set. And then that does seem to be causing lots of people problems because they're rubbing up against those systems. And then Fiona's gone on to post to say that their CPD out of this pilot has been very much targeted at mental health, safeguarding and teaching, but that systems thinking looks like a really interesting area to develop. And I'm certainly thinking that if we are successful with the year 2, that it might be really important. I mean, this time we might get some advance notice because everybody had to hit the ground running, but it might be quite important to build that in as part of the support for everybody before we start, and then as we go along.
Just a word on who needs to be in that kind of group. When I first came across collaborative inquiry, I worried a lot about who should be in the collaborative group and how could I get everyone in. But I was very relieved to be advised you don't have to have everyone in the group, but what you do need to do is to pay attention to those who should have been in the group who are not in the group. And the group as it exists is legitimate. Whoever's there, whoever comes is the right people, is a wonderful expression. But the right people might have to sit down and discuss, well, we're missing a very important partner here. What do we do about that? How do we relate to them? Do we need to go and see them? How do we involve them? It doesn't mean they have to be in the group, but the fact that they're there and they're part of the system does need to be thought about.
That's really helpful. The other couple of people who are here and who've used something I know similar is Erelie and Nadine. Your pilot had an open space day, which I remember Anita facilitated, who used to do them. Helen will remember, for those of us at NIACE, Alan Tuckett used to ask her to come in and facilitate kind of our team away day once a year. And I know you had that open conferencing session with your partners very deliberately to kind of look at really what I thought was a systems thinking approach to how that was going to work. And I've also noticed, looking at the data, you've had amazing results in terms of the numbers that you've had through recently. So clearly the system is working for learners. I just wondered if you're still there, if you want to throw a comment in or two. You look as if you're still here. It doesn't say you've left the building yet, virtually, but you might not be brave enough to say. Okay, so I can't see that anybody's typing. Maybe I could ask you to type something else then, which might be helpful, which is just to say, I don't know if you need a bit of time to go away and think about this and then come back. Do you want me to see if Martin could come back to us for us to have a discussion in which we have a discussion? Maybe in a week's time or 2 weeks' time or something, with examples from you.
Oh, hi, Katina. It's Sarah here. I can't get the typing to work. I don't know if other people are having trouble.
Are you on an iPad by any chance, Sarah?
No, a laptop, but it just doesn't send. So it might be why people aren't participating. But I would be very keen in being further involved, and I was going to suggest maybe we tried to pick it up with our regional partners and maybe see if we've got to put a bit of money in, if we've got any left. Okay,
there's actually an ETF ITT out at the moment, and we've been dithering about whether to bid for it for some money that would support pilots. So that's a possibility that we could actually use this as a bit of needs assessment and say that, you know, maybe you contribute a bit from your budget and we get the ETF to contribute a bit via the LMAG opportunity. That might work quite well. So if you can't type in the chat, email me afterwards then, okay? You've all got my email address. Email me afterwards. Thank you, Sarah, for telling us that.
I was just going to say that open space is a very systems-y. One of the big things around systems is how do you obtain the voice of the unemancipated? You know, how do we emancipate the voice, especially of service users and so on? And open space can be a very good way of doing that. And there's always an issue about who sets the agenda. That's a power issue. So open space is a form of agenda, but it's an agenda that gives the agenda to everyone else. So yeah, it's a good systemic approach.
Okay, does anybody else have anything else they want to add, or otherwise I'm going to let Martin go. Fiona has said she's sorry she's got another appointment to go to, and that's exactly it, but okay. She'd appreciate taking it further, and thank you very much. And I'm aware that most people...
I'll just leave, if I could just leave you then with a little thing, a bit of noticing to do. Obviously notice your assumptions and beliefs, but a nice bit of noticing to do is, how do you currently deal with the unexpected? How do you currently deal with emergent change? What's your don't judge yourself, just notice. How do you deal with unexpected events occurring? By the way, if you do judge yourself, don't judge yourself for judging yourself. We all do it all the time. We can't help it. It's just built into us from a very early age. But just try to go for noticing and describing rather than judging and defining. But just notice how you are with unexpected emergence. That's
Thank you for that, Martin. That's great. Okay, so we're going to close this down now. I think there isn't anything in the recording that we couldn't share, so I'll post the recording up later, and Martin and I'll have a conversation. But thank you all very much for joining us, and we have to find a way to get your microphones working next time. But thank you, Helen and Sarah, for kind of managing to do that. I realise some people are in open plan offices and can only do it that way. And Lloyd, I'm sorry I forced you into speaking, but it was lovely to meet you. Okay, thank you all very much indeed. I'm going to press stop record now. You can reach us by email and whatever afterwards. And if there is anybody who wants to hang back for a one-to-one with Martin for 5 minutes, he's still here. But otherwise, goodbye to everybody else.